A new report from a Chinese labor group alleges labor violations at a second Apple contractor. Welcome to Asia Today. I'm Yun-Hee Kim. Joining me to discuss this story is Paul Mozur, reporter in Beijing. Paul, you've had a very busy day. This new report just surfaced. Tell us what China Labor Watch had to say about the labor conditions at this Apple supplier called Pegatron.
Well, there's a whole range of things they run through. It starts with very common things you hear: very crowded dorms, long shifts, long hours, workers required to stand throughout their shifts. But the more serious abuses we're hearing are that, at least what China Labor Watch says, is that workers are not necessarily being paid in full. In particular, workers who work for a short time at the factories. And another abuse that Apple actually said it did find out happened and helped to solve was that workers' identifications were actually taken for a short period of time when they were recruited. And this might have been to sort of encourage them to stay longer at a factory where conditions were particularly harsh. There are also accusations that they poured a toxic cutting fluid into drains, which is illegal according to Chinese environmental law and also Apple's policy. And then finally, there were some pretty unsafe conditions for one of the lines that makes the back of the iPad. When it was being cut, when you sort of cut the back of the iPad, there's these shards that come off of aluminum, and workers were not given sort of proper equipment so that when they clean that machine, if they cut themselves, they didn't necessarily have access to first aid or other things, and they were required to just tape themselves up with industrial tape and then continue working. So there's a whole range of things here, and a lot of them are problems, both according to Apple's supplier agreement and also according to Chinese labor law.
Now, these are pretty serious allegations, Paul, and you've independently verified with some of these workers. What do they have to say about the actual working conditions at some of these factories?
Well, one of the things going on here is working conditions in the electronic supply chain in China are almost universally harsh. Abuses are pretty frequent. A lot of these things, while maybe not totally run-of-the-mill, are not that extraordinary. But the interesting thing is that Apple has set a very high bar for itself. So, in terms of having some of these violations come from Apple's new a supplier that's getting new orders from Apple, that is a pretty big deal. And workers obviously, talk about it. A lot of them felt, defrauded when they were basically brought in by recruiting companies, and only after they tried to leave a factory after a month or something would they find out that the recruiting company that brought them in and hired them for the factory was going to dock their pay because they left too quickly. Other workers, at one factory just couldn't even last. The average turnover at this one factory was about anywhere between 10 to 15 days, and workers said the shifts were long, machines were loud, toxic chemicals around, and they were just so exhausted that basically they came and left, and some workers even came for the one day and just left at the end of one shift. So that shows you how rough some of the conditions are at some of these places.
Right. And Paul, tell us a little bit more about this company known as Pegatron. When we think about the Apple suppliers, many people just talk about Foxconn, but this company actually makes some big products for Apple. So give us more details on what Pegatron is all about.
Yeah, so Pegatron, it's long been a contract manufacturer of electronics. It used to be owned by ASUS, but it was spun off from ASUS, obviously the computer maker in Taiwan, in 2010. And since then, it's been ramping up orders for a number of international companies. But over the past year to 2 years, they've really been getting a lot of Apple orders. They have orders for several versions of the iPhone. They've gotten a lot of orders for the iPad mini, and then they also now have orders for the cheaper iPhone that Apple's working on. And what's going on there is just that they've basically, what Apple has done is they've tried to diversify their supply chain after there were problems in production of the iPhone 5 at Foxconn plants last year. At the same time, Pegatron's able to make some of these things a bit cheaper, willing to take a bigger hit on the margin than Foxconn is. So as a result, it's attractive to Apple, and so Apple's switched over. But the problem is when this happens, Foxconn's done a lot of work with the FLA and with other labor groups, and over and over again engage the media, whereas Pegatron is relatively obscure. So when you go into some of the to the plants, you see some of the violations that maybe you were seeing at Foxconn a year or 2 years ago.
And Paul, can you tell us what Apple's reaction has been to this report, and also what Pegatron had to say about the report today?
Well, both Pegatron and a subsidiary that operates two of its companies are saying they're going to investigate. They say they question some of the accusations. But if they find out, for instance, that recruitment companies are taking worker pay, that they will break off their relationship with those companies. Apple itself sent would sort of an uncharacteristically long statement describing that that in fact 44 workers did have their IDs taken for a short time, and that they put an end to that. They're doing a special investigation into the two plants where abuses were the worst, and they're also sort of doing a general audit. They've said they've audited Pegatron quite a bit in the past, and that hours weren't as high as the report claims, and that some of the other abuses, like workers not getting paid, also didn't come up. But within the report, they talk about factories kind of gaming the system to ensure that workers sign false cards that show that their hours aren't as long, and workers sort of, being made to kind of say that conditions aren't as bad as they really are. Certainly, a lot of the workers we talked to vouched for this report. So it remains to be seen how Apple will ultimately respond down the line to this.
Okay, a very interesting story that we'll be following very closely. Thanks very much, Paul Mozur, joining us today from Beijing. For more on this story, you can go to WSJ.com. I'm Yun-Hee Kim for the Wall Street Journal Digital Network. Thanks for watching.